My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. All right. Well, once again, we're looking at the relationship between the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15, Romans chapter 8. In Romans chapter 8, Paul spoke of the birth pangs. Paul said that the whole creation groans in labor pains until now. And he talks about the suffering of that present time, the first century present times. And I've been sharing with you the absolute interrelationship between the Great Tribulation, the end time last days suffering, and the resurrection. You know, folks, it's very difficult to overemphasize this. This is one of those, you must catch the power of this. And it is a subject and a theme that I discuss extensively. In fact, I don't know of another work that has such an extensive discussion of the relationship between the Great Tribulation and the resurrection as I develop in this book, The Resurrection of Daniel, chapter 12, verse 2, fulfilled or future. You will not find another work like this. And to simply state that, throughout the Old Testament, throughout the Tanakh, there is an absolutely inseparable relationship between the Great Tribulation and the resurrection. It is absolutely astounding to me, the desperation of some commentators, some former preterists even, who want to insert tremendous gaps of time between the Great Tribulation and the resurrection. There is no such temporal gap. That is just simply an argument from desperation in order to hold on to a futurist eschatology. There's no justification for it, folks. It's nothing but a remodeled, remade, revised dispensational gap doctrine. And it is really, honestly, I want to be kind here, but it's really quite inexcusable to come up with that kind of a gap doctrine. Okay, I mentioned that I would share with you this continuing pattern between the birth pains, the Great Tribulation, the coming of the Lord, judgment, resurrection. And nowhere is it more graphically or more clearly delineated and explained than in Matthew chapter 24. Remember, I shared with you that in Matthew 24, in verses 4 and following, where Jesus warned his apostles about being deceived. But he told them there's going to be wars and rumors of wars. There will be famine, earthquakes, pestilence, peril, etc., etc. And he said, these are the beginning of birth pains. Remember, Paul, writing in the late 50s, at a time when all of these things were taking place, said the whole creation groans in labor pains until now. Okay? And remember, where did Paul get his doctrine? From Jesus himself. So Jesus spoke of the labor pains and said they would be in that generation. Paul said the labor pains were on them when he wrote during the 50s. Okay, now watch this. So Jesus spoke of those labor pains of Messiah. And he says they're going to deliver you up to tribulation. That's part of the birth pains. Paul talks about the suffering of the saints in Romans chapter 8, verse 18. Now notice what he does, what Jesus does in Matthew 24. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, Daniel chapter 9, Daniel chapter 12, foretold the coming and the placing of the abomination of desolation, number 1, within the 70 weeks, Daniel 9. Number 2, at the time of the end, Daniel chapter 12, verses 4, 9, and 10. So Jesus said, and remember, they had a precedent for this. They had a typological fulfillment in the days of Antiochus Epiphanes, according to Daniel 11. So just like Antiochus had performed his wickedness and his evil, Jesus was using that as a template. And he's saying, remember what happened then? Well, Daniel also foretold what would happen at the time of the end. The abomination of desolation at the time of the end. Now watch this. When you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Understand what? Daniel foretold the time of the end. Daniel foretold the abomination of desolation in the time of the end. What are the disciples asking about? The signs of the end of the age. All right. Then let those who are in Judea flee. And then he gave other warnings. Now, notice, for then when? When that abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet was set up in the holy place, for then shall be great tribulation, such as has not been since the foundation of the world, beginning of the world, until this time, nor ever yet shall be. Well, look, this is Daniel chapter 12, verse 1. Specifically, it's a direct quote. Here is Jesus quoting from Daniel chapter 12 that foretold the abomination of desolation. Here is Jesus quoting from Daniel chapter 12, verse 1, for the great tribulation. When was it to be? At the time of the end, at the time of the resurrection. So here we have Jesus, Matthew 24, the birth pangs of Messiah. Matthew 24, verse 15, the abomination of desolation. Matthew 24, 21, the great tribulation. Abomination of desolation, great tribulation. But watch this, verse 29. Immediately after the tribulation of those days. What days? The days of the abomination of desolation. The days in which, if they were on the housetops, they better not go, and they saw the abomination of desolation take place, they better not try to come down. They better flee. Folks, if this is talking about the coming of the Lord at the so-called end of time, that supposedly that would be over, in a moment, in a twinkling of an eye, why tell them don't go down into the houses? You don't have time to flee. Jesus is very clearly talking about events in Jerusalem and Judea and in their lifetime. Now remember, the Great Tribulation and the resurrection are absolutely inextricably bound together. So immediately after the tribulation of those days, what would happen? Well, we'll skip to verse 30. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn. They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And folks, that's the coming of the Lord. What's the coming of the Lord? Resurrection. But watch this. What do we have? Matthew 24, verse 8, the beginning of birth pains. Number 2, abomination of desolation. Number 3, great tribulation. Number 4, coming of the Lord. Folks, these are absolutely eschatological elements. They are not a coming of the Lord. It is the coming of the Lord that is inextricably bound up with what? The great tribulation, which is linked to what? Resurrection. Matthew 24 is an incredible prophecy of the resurrection. When did Jesus say it would all take place? Matthew 24:34. Verily I say unto you, this generation will by no means pass away until all of these things are fulfilled. Now look, in one of my upcoming videos, I'm going to share with you what amillennialists believe about the Great Tribulation, what postmillennialists believe about the Great Tribulation. It's going to blow your mind what they admit, because they fail to see the absolute inseparable bond between the Great Tribulation and the resurrection. We will see you on the flip side. Thanks for joining me.